Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel, BethChatsBooks. Now today I'm kind of going to do a mini double book review as such. So I'm going to do a review of Sally Rooney's Conversation with Friends, and I'm also going to do a review of Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, but I listened to that on audiobook, so I do not have a physical copy to hand. But I wanted to kind of do them together because I read them at the same time, but equally they had some quite interesting things to say about relationships, sex, gender, kind of about sexual intimacy in relationships, about monogamy, and reading them at the same time was a very interesting reading experience. So I'm kind of going to talk about Sally Rooney's first because there's also probably going to be a bit of a small comparison to how I felt between this and Normal People. So this one really, in hindsight, should kind of be read before Normal People, I think, because this shows where the evolution to Normal People came from. Halfway through this book, they mention a character called Marianne, which is interesting because that's the main protagonist's name in Normal People. And it talks a little bit less about class and kind of place less in this than it does in Normal People. But there's some overlaps between the main protagonists. So there's Frances in this one and Marianne in Normal People. Now both of them seem quite similar in some ways to me. Their vulnerability, their mental health. This book deals with an element of self-harm, to some extent the same in Normal People. There's quite upsetting themes between both main protagonists. They see themselves in a very hard to read light. They don't like themselves as troubled, cold, aloof. And when I was reading this one in particular, well, to some extent Marianne as well, because I also really worried about both of them when I left them because they didn't seem stable, and the men that they chose in their life, or the women as well, really didn't help their mental health in a good way. So in this one, Frances is a lot younger and she starts having an affair with an individual who's married, and an actor, and their relationship, it's not really romantic for most of it, to be honest. He's very passive with her and she's very confused, and then she goes through some things, and at the end they kind of decide that their relationship's kind of problematic, but they will continue it, which was a bit meh for me. But I felt like Frances was incredibly vulnerable in this book, and so was Marianne in Normal People, and there was nobody there to protect them. The men in their lives exploited them to some extent. They didn't understand them. There was meant to be some romantic gesture from them to fix things, and nobody in this book or in Normal People really registered that potentially Frances might have mental health issues. Kind of best friends / she had a romantic relationship with in this book is a bit of a cow at times. I feel she's just not very sympathetic and sensitive. Kind of evokes memories for me of when people kind of throw character traits on you that you kind of work through and work around and realise that it's not necessarily you. And I feel like Frances got thrown a lot of character flaws and characteristics from all the main people in the book that I didn't think fit her at all. I didn't think she was cold. I think she was extremely delicate, and she had to carry a lot, and she had no one to talk to about it, and so I found it quite sad. I think this book was fairly interesting in terms of the look at monogamy and how in the end the married couple kind of accepted affairs and they stayed together and they had this weird triangle relationship towards the end. It was an interesting look on kind of monogamy. In this book, sex was a real issue for me, and the sexual relationships, because I felt Frances's vulnerability engaging in those relationships that I could kind of sympathise with, and he didn't really give her a lot back. So this played into the stereotypes of men and women's sexual relationships in a negative way. And I didn't like that. So I gave this 3.5. I like the topic she's raising, Sally Rooney, as a writer, but she just doesn't deal with them adequately. She's raising this idea of monogamy in affairs, but she's not discussing it in a way I would have liked. She's raising the complexity of young women at a similar age to herself. I completely get that. I respect that. But she's not dealing with it in the best way for me. And I think it's quite sad if young people read this and think that Frances's life in any way is something to replicate or to aspire to. So that's how I feel about that. And then Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. Now, this is interesting because I've heard a lot of people say it's the classic version of 50 Shades of Grey, and a lot of people have criticised him as a man for writing about sex in such a way, because he's a man, and it goes a lot into Connie, the character of Connie, and how she feels during sex and her relationships. I do to some extent think it does play into a little bit of the stereotype of the hysterical woman who kind of falls into infatuation with somebody. But it's a really interesting book. In the 60s it was banned because it is, surprisingly for me when I was listening to it, very open about sex. Some of the sex scenes are explicit, depending on what you think is explicit. It goes into actual sex. But it doesn't, I don't think it does it in a pornographic way. It's really interesting, the dynamic, because Connie has a husband, Clifford, who has been injured by the war. It kind of goes into the idea that he physically cannot have children and he physically cannot satisfy Connie in a sexual sense in the relationship. And so she develops this relationship with the gamekeeper. But what's so interesting is the book has kind of been sold so much on the explicit sex and the relationship, and obviously an affair within a marriage and a lot of those cultural and social implications at the time. However, there was a lot of things in the book that I don't think really were part of that. I think there were some deep themes around class in particular, the effect of war. So class was really interesting because, oh, I've forgotten his name, the gamekeeper now. Mellors. He helped out in the war effort, and he kind of ended up, because of his class status after the war, kind of coming back, and he worked on the grounds. He's an intelligent man, but it was really interesting, this dynamic between the older class and the new class structure that was emerging. And Clifford is kind of old money, and the estate of what was it called, because it always used to annoy me, Rugby. But Maxine Peake narrated it and she kept saying rugby. So I don't know if it's pronounced rugby or not, but I'm going to say rugby. The estate of Rugby was Clifford's inherited all the way down the line, and it was kind of this class dynamic of that, keeping the old money, keeping the old ways, and this new evolution. And then there was a lot of commentary on mining and the Midlands, where the book is set. So I think the book was very rich on a lot of other themes, not just sex and relationships. Towards the end, when she ends up pregnant with Mellors' child, and she kind of decides to make a go of it with him, I thought that was problematic, because the relationship fundamentally was based on sex, not love, I believe. So I don't think it would have had the longevity to have really made it. However, I also feel like Clifford and Connie wouldn't have ended up still together and worked their way through it. So it's problematic in so many ways, but I like that because it didn't have a reassuring ending, but it shows the complexity of human nature, the mistakes that we make, the situations we embroil ourselves in. And in a weird way, had a lot more of a realistic representation of sex and relationships in this particular book for me. The characters were faulted. It was all messy. There was nobody who became a winner out of the situation. But I gave that 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. The only slight things were towards the end. I thought that the plot kind of lost itself a little bit, and it was kind of throwing these things out there, scandal, more than to enhance the plot. But I did really enjoy it. And I think it gives you a lot of food for thought. I think that book will be something that I will appreciate more upon a reread. But yeah, I just thought they were an interesting dynamic between the two, because they really raise sex and relationships in some ways in very similar ways, because they are both kind of affairs and they're limited in their capacity to grow. But I think Sally Rooney tapped more into the feminine mindset during the affair, which I did find really interesting. I mean, I think it was limited what D.H. Lawrence could say about Connie, how she really felt, and whether her naivety in some situations was justified or not. But I think they both deal with similar themes, but in very different ways, and considering one was the 1920s, I believe, and one's just last year or this year, it's really interesting to see the longevity of these topics. So that's it for this book review. I'm going to keep that nice and short. I have read another book since, Convenience Store Woman, which I will talk about, but I'm going to plan to start another audiobook and to start another physical book, so I'll just do a recent reads for that one. But I just felt like these two books, I had a lot to say that I wanted to offload. So thank you guys so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button if you want to be alerted when any of my future videos come out, and I'll be back very soon with a brand new video. Bye now.